We have a deluge of them as we approach the top of the hour. My name is Juliana Barabbas. You have arrived at the Mixed Methods webinar, Developing and Connecting Claims in Mixed Methods Research. It's going to run for about an hour this morning. Again, my name is Juliana Barabbas. I'm with the University of Alberta IIQM in the Faculty of Nursing in Edmonton, Canada. I'll give you a little bit of background for those who may not be familiar with MMIRA. They were founded in 2013 as a forum to advance dialogue about mixed methods research amongst a diverse group of scholars globally, and I think we have a good representation with the 45 of you here today. This series has been ongoing for a number of years, and we're really pleased to welcome today Judith Schoonenboom, who is presenting Developing and Connecting Claims in Mixed Methods Research, a case-based approach. For those of you who just arrived, we are taking questions through the chat window, so please do test out that chat window, and I'll be reading those questions throughout the webinar, just in between each of the slides. I'd like to introduce Judith now, and then she will take the floor, as it were. Judith Schoonenboom holds the chair for empirical pedagogy at the University of Vienna, Austria. She specializes in mixed methods in educational research. She is an associate editor of the Journal of Mixed Methods Research. She has wide experience in designing and evaluating innovations in education, with a special interest in educational technology. Her research interests include mixed methods design and the foundations of mixed methods research. Her most recent publication is Develop Your Case: How Controversial Cases, Subcases, and Moderated Cases Can Guide You Through a Mixed Methods Data Analysis. This is in Frontiers in Psychology. Together with her assistant, Mr. Heinz Ganzer, she organized the biannual Global MMIRA 2018 conference in Vienna. The conference was very successful, with 273 mixed methods researchers from 39 countries attending, among them many early career researchers and many who attended an MMIRA conference for the first time. Judith is MMIRA's current president-elect. And Judith, I would like to welcome you to take over.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Juliana, for this introduction and kind words. And hello, everyone. I'm very glad that you are all here and that I have been given the opportunity to share some of my thoughts on mixed methods design with you. Yes, indeed, the title of my presentation is Developing and Connecting Claims in Mixed Method Research, a case-based approach. And I will start by giving you an overview of what we will discuss in the hour to come. We start with the meta-inference in mixed method research, which is a very important element. It is the conclusion that connects or integrates various claims from qualitative and quantitative research. And perhaps even more important, this presentation will show you how mixed method researchers can gradually develop or weave their meta-inference throughout their study. And I will also say that a mixed method study develops a case, by which I mean a theoretical understanding of a phenomenon. And I will present 3 stages, and I will say that a mixed method study develops a controversial case when one claim contradicts another claim from, for example, previous research or another claim within the same study. It develops subcases when different claims apply to different subgroups. It develops a moderated case when it shows under which circumstances one of its claims applies or does not apply, which leads to the subcases, and it does so in the order of first a controversial case, then subcases, and then a moderated case. And I I will demonstrate these processes using two real-life examples. And also, interestingly, I think, is that this process is independent of whether the study's original design is concurrent or sequential. So with respect to this mixed methods process, it's not that important whether the design is concurrent or sequential. And finally, using these processes of case and claim development affects how quality in mixed method research is defined. Okay, good. I think there are no questions until now, so I will start then by having a look at how the meta-inference is considered in the mixed method literature. So to repeat, a mixed method study contains one or more qualitative research strands and one or more quantitative research strands. Each of these strands generates its own conclusions, or sometimes people speak about inferences, or sometimes about claims. In the word meta-inferences, the word inference is used. We will use in this presentation mostly the word claim, but also the word conclusion is used, and basically both the three of them actually mean the same. They're statements, conclusions, like let's say, providing textbooks raises academic performance, or another claim, through observations, children use the playhouse often. So there can be many types of conclusions and claims, but they all have in common that they are statements. So the meta-inference is special because it is the overall conclusion in which claims of the research strands are, so to speak, integrated, blended, or linked. So, for example, a conclusion might be children use the playhouse often and they value it highly, for example. It occurs, according to the mixed method literature, at the end of a study, and it is the hallmark of mixed methods research.
And Judith, we do have a question from one of our attendees. You'll see it at the side. One of mixed methods aims is initiation. What does it mean, and how can mixed methods research be conducted by imitation? And I think, I'm not sure, Mohammed, can you clarify, are you talking initiation or imitation?
Perhaps I can also say to this question.
There we are. Sorry, Judith.
Yeah. It's initiation, and initiation is one of the purposes of mixed method research, but I think that it's also one of the purposes that we can use in our proposal of these various stages of mixed method research. Okay, then I will go to the next slide. So again, to emphasize the citation by Tetley and Tasha Corey, who said the quality of the entire research project depends on the degree to which integration, blending, or linking of qualitative and quantitative inferences is achieved, which means that the inferences and not so much mixing of methods is important, but in the end it's the inferences, and they are really very important because the quality of the entire research project depends on them. Okay, so we can
proceed.
Yeah, we can visualize this as follows. We can say, okay, we can have quantitative methods, which I can use this one. Quantitative methods, which leads to claims, and these are represented by represented by these rectangles, and then we can have qualitative methods leading to claims represented by the ellipses, and together they lead to a meta-inference, and we can say, well, the meta-inference is kind of mixed. Okay, and we can also put them into the whole of mixed methods study. So we can have a look at the meta-inference in mixed methods in fully integrated mixed method design. So in the literature, often it's stated that mixed method design should be fully integrated, by which scholars mean that we should integrate at the level of design, so having kind of qualitative designs combined with quantitative designs. We should also integrate at the level of mental models, which could be quantitative or qualitative. According to Tetley and Tasha Corey, at the level of conceptualization, we can have more quantitative and qualitative. So at all these levels, we should really mix. And so we should also then arrive at the level of methods. We should mix qualitative and quantitative methods. We should mix quantitative and qualitative data. We should mix qualitative and quantitative analysis. We should mix qualitative and quantitative findings. And then in the end, we have claims, and these which are derived from both quantitative and qualitative method, data analysis, findings, conceptualizations, etc. And then in the end, we have this meta-inference. So that's how fully integrated design and meta-inferences are presented in the mixed method literature. Okay, well, then I will go on. But there's one problem, which is that mixed method research is iterative. So mixed method research, as Caracelli and Green said already in 1993, has the potential to spiral iteratively around the different data sets, adding depth of understanding with each cycle. And also Reagan, speaking about case study research, said it's the interaction between ideas and evidence which results in a progressive refinement of theoretical understanding. But this iteration is not reflected in the position of the meta-inference, because what we saw is that the meta-inference is located at the end of the study, after all the other levels. We have progressed through all the other levels, and then at the end there is the meta-inference. So in this visualization of mixed method research, there is actually no iteration, and that's a problem. Okay, so how are we going to solve this problem? I think we can solve the problem by saying, no, the meta-inference does not occur at the end of the study, but it is also emergent. So we can start with a quantitative method A and a claim 1, a qualitative method B and a claim 2, and we can then connect the two, and then we have an integrated claim 3. But we can go further and say, okay, method B also, from method B we derive claim 4, and we can go further and then connect claim 4 to integrated claim 3, which leads us to integrated claim 5. But we can go even further and say we have a third method, method C, which itself is a mixed method. And that leads to claim 6, and we can then integrate claim 6 and claim 5, and then we have claim 7. And indeed, claim 7 is the meta-inference, but as you see, the meta-inference does not occur at the end, but it's built up gradually. The meta-inference is also emergent. Okay, good. This might sound very abstract still, so I will give you a first example. And it's a study that I've used many times before as an example. It's a study by Glebe, Creamer, and Moulin, and they studied the provision of textbook to primary school children in rural Kenya, and they found out that providing these textbooks did not have an effect on students' quantitative test scores. And when they then did a subsequent qualitative inquiry in the schools, they asked children to read their textbooks, and that showed that the majority of the children were unable to read these difficult textbooks because they were written in English, which was not their first language. And further quantitative subgroup analysis showed that there was an effect for some students, namely students with high pretest scores, most probably because they were able to read their textbooks. Now, this is a description, yes?
Judith, we do have one question before you dive in. What is the difference between case study and mixed methods?
I am describing a very good question. Thank you. I'm describing a process of developing a case, what I call developing a case as a theoretical understanding of a phenomenon. And I think this happens in case study as well, but it's much broader. It also applies to perhaps not all, but much of mixed method research.
Thank you, Judith.
Okay. Okay, then we can dive in a bit deeper into this example. So here we start with previous research, which had shown in general providing textbook raises average test scores in primary schools. So we can also say we are already starting with a meta-inference, but it's an or at least an inference, which is taken from previous research. And then our next step from a quantitative analysis of test scores is that providing textbooks does not raise average test scores for children in primary schools in rural Kenya. And what we now have is a contradiction between these two. And we can then connect both claims in a larger claim which contains this contradiction, namely providing textbooks raises average test scores elsewhere, but it does not do so in primary schools in rural Kenya. And so we could say here we also have an inference, and then we go further, because the next step are the qualitative observations of the median child, which show the median child could not read its textbook because it was written in English, which is not its native language. And then we have an explanation for this contradiction, and we can connect the two claims again. And then we have our first, so to speak, real meta-inference, because it's based on qualitative and quantitative research, which says providing textbooks raises average test scores as well elsewhere, but it does not do so in primary schools in rural Kenya because children could not read their textbook. So this is a nice meta-inference, but we can continue and then do another analysis of the quantitative test scores, which then showed textbooks did increase the scores of the students with high pretest scores. And then we have a contradiction, because we have said it does not raise test scores in rural Kenya, but here we have a group for which providing textbooks does raise test scores. So we have this contradiction, but we also have then an explanation, because that this explanation is not found through method, but simply through reasoning. the explanation is most probably these students could read their textbook, and if we combine this all, we have, so to speak, our final meta-inference, which says providing textbook raised average test scores as well elsewhere, but not in primary schools in rural Kenya. They didn't not have an effect for most children because they could not read them because they were written in English, which is not their native language. And however, they did increase the scores of students with high pre-test scores because these children were most likely able to read them. Okay?
Yes.
Okay, then I will continue. Because we have now seen that the meta-inference develops, emerges, but we have not yet described this as case development. And that's now I will turn to case development. So I say that a mixed method study, and most people would say that, develops a deep understanding of a phenomenon. And we could also say it develops a case in the sense of a theoretical construct. As it has been said by Reagan in 1992, for example, an investigator interested in tyranny as a case, he or she would study many possible instances of tyranny, and that might lead to an identification of an important subset of instances with many common characteristics. For example, patrimonial praetorianism, whatever that may be, or as cases of modern tyranny. And as Reagan said, so interaction between ideas and evidence results in a progressive refinement of the case conceived as a theoretical construct. Okay, so as I said in my introduction, I assume that this case development has three stages. So a mixed method study can develop a controversial case when it develops a claim that contradicts previous research or another claim within the same study. It develops subcases when it shows that different claims apply to different subgroups. It develops a moderated case when it shows under which circumstances one of its claims does or does not apply, which leads then to the subcases. And in general, a mixed method study moves from a controversial case to subcases to a moderated case. And we can show this process in our example. So first, there is this controversial case. We have, on the one hand, the claim providing textbooks raises average test scores in primary schools. On the other hand, we have the claim providing textbook does not raise average test scores for children in primary schools in rural Kenya. Then we develop subcases. Namely these groups. One group with the claim textbooks did increase the scores of students with high pretest scores, and for the other students the claim textbooks did not increase their scores. And then, most importantly, is the moderated case. And the moderated case means that we also explain why these two subcases. So we can still say textbooks have an effect on test score, in the sense textbooks increase test scores, but they only do that when children are able to read their textbook. So the ability to read the textbook is a so-called moderator. When the ability is there, textbooks will have an effect on test scores. When the ability to read a textbook is not there, is not present, then textbooks will not have an effect on test scores. Okay?
Yes, indeed.
Okay, then I will give a second example. And that was a reanalysis that I did of a study by Lee and Green in 2007, who discovered that test scores of graduate students, international students on English as a second language did not affect their grade point average in their first semester. They had expected it would, because the idea was if you experience language problems, then this will affect your GPA, but actually it did not. Well, in a reanalysis of the data that were available in the published article, including the test scores, GPA, and interview fragments with 20 students, I identified a group of successful students who, in spite of an imperfect command of the English language, still obtained the highest GPA possible. And further analysis showed that these students, but not others, mentioned strategies for overcoming their language problems in their interviews. So here are these data, and we should actually only focus on those in yellow. And what we see here is these students had a less than perfect command of the English language. They still had the highest possible GPA, which was 4. And if you look at their statements very carefully, you can see, for example, student 0609 says that the professor is old and his pronunciation is not clear. He usually handed out important contents, and I could understand it by reading the textbook. So this student says, well, there is a problem with this professor and his pronunciation, but I had a strategy because I could understand it by reading the textbook. And so the second student says, well, yes, I have problems related with speaking in English, but I will get a good grade because my mathematical background is strong. So also this student mentions something that he or she uses to overcome the language problems. And the third student says, well, I understand 80% of the lectures, which is not everything, but then careful reading complements 20% of lack of understanding. So these 3 students who had language problems, but still the highest possible GPA, all referred to some compensating strategy. And basically the other students, so the students that are mentioned here, here, and here, did mention language problems, but not strategies to overcome these. And also this study can be displayed as a development of a controversial case, sub-cases, and a moderated case. And I think I will first display that slide before I take the next question. Oh, this can go. So let me see. The controversial case in this case is language problems affect GPA as a statement versus the statement language problems do not affect GPA. So here we have a contradiction. Then we have our subcases, namely we have some students with language problems who had the highest GPA and other students with language problems who did not obtain the highest GPA possible. And in the end, we have the moderated case, we have the explanation. We can still say, yes, language problems have an influence on basically lead to a lower GPA unless students have these compensating strategies. So here the compensating strategies, when they are not there, then language problems indeed lead to a lower GPA. But if students have compensating strategies, then this effect language will not occur. And although these students have language problems, they still obtain the highest GPA possible. Okay.
So Judith, we did have a couple of questions. Would you like to take both of those now?
Yes, you can. One question.
So,
Let me see. What? Yeah.
so I'll read this one out from Mohammed. What do you think of Creswell
Yeah.
and Clarl's mixed methods designs?
Well, I think these designs in general are, I think, very, very useful for mixed method researchers. But, and that I will show later, this process of case development is independent from the design in the Creswellian sense.
And then a question from Ezra. Ezra has been told that a study that does not show power analysis cannot be called quantitative. Therefore, if a study collects quantitative data from 25 to 50 participants, it's not really quantitative. How does that play out in mixed method studies that evaluate qual and quant data from 20 students, for example? And thanks you for any answer.
Yes, I thank you very much for that question. I will sorry, I will return to this slide. Basically, the fact that there was not an effect of language score on GPA was based on, I think, 100 or 200 participants. And the data that so that was not based on 25, but on much more students. And what I did was that I took those, indeed, I think 20 or 25 students who also had been interviewed, and I used there the quantitative and qualitative data in this table. And I use this table to find out these compensating strategies. But for that claim, I did not use the quantitative effect, but I used a kind of, also one could say, case-based approach. I did not look at the effect, but I tried to identify various groups. And on the basis of that, I was able to see this group that had these compensating strategies. And of course, that's not a real, one could say, solid conclusion, but it is an interesting idea because it was almost without exceptions that I found this, and only in this small amount of data. So I still think as a hypothesis, it's very interesting. And of course, as I said, it's not a solid conclusion, and one should do further research to really draw firm conclusions.
Thank you, Judith. And one more question as you were answering that one. How can one determine sample size in mixed methods design, especially in the qualitative strand?
I think much depends upon the role of qualitative and quantitative. Well, I should perhaps stick with this table because I think it works very well. I call these kind of tables case comparison tables. And one thing, what's very important is whether you want to use the quantitative data to establish a quantitative effect or not. As I told you, for establishing an effect, you need much more than 20 students. For investigating the qualitative quotations of the students, you would need much less. What is important, I think, in qualitative research, and what works really very well, is if you have some kind of, say, standardized questionnaire, you can then use that questionnaire, and on the basis of the outcomes, you can select students, and then you will have, if you, for example, select students with a very high GPA, middle or low, and then investigate their strategies, what they're doing, you will really find differences. So I think in general for qualitative research, selecting students on the basis of a questionnaire is a very good idea. For example, I myself did a research study on procrastination, and really the students with high procrastination, middle procrastination, or low procrastination, as we interviewed them, it really turned out to be really 3 different worlds, and I think that's great.
Thank you so much, Judith. The questions are coming in quickly at this point. Are you okay to answer a few more before we continue?
Yes.
Okay, so we did have a question, what is concurrent mixed method? And Guru Preet came back with concurrent means you collect quant and qual data at approximately the same time. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would agree with that, and later on I will also explain why for this for the case development process that's less relevant.
Fair
yes.
enough. And then from Seema, could we use the quantitative data to develop a sampling strategy like a sequential design? Like in this case, we could use the quantitative data to identify who to interview for a qualitative study.
Yes, I agree, and basically that was what I was trying to explain. Yeah.
Thank you, Judith.
Okay. Well, then I will continue. Yes, this one I showed. Okay, so in summary, I think mixed method research develops a case related to a specific phenomenon. I think that the mixed method inference in mixed method research, or I hope that I've shown, develops throughout the study, so reflecting a growing understanding of the case as a theoretical construct. And this development process often, not always, but often progresses through the stages controversial case, subcases, and moderated case. Okay. Well, then I would like to discuss the implications for mixed method research. So I think it has implications for the meta-inference, which I hopefully have already shown, namely a meta-inference can go on and on and on. Whether an integrated claim is the meta-inference of a study basically does not depend on its form, but it depends on where a researcher decides to stop. And I will first continue to the next slide before I take questions. So in this picture, I mean, yes, integrated claim 7 is the meta-inference, but in case the researcher had decided to stop after applying method A and B, then integrated claim 5 would have been the meta-inference. And also, if the researcher had decided to stop after obtaining claim 1 and claim 2, then integrated claim 3 would have been the meta-inference.
And Judith, would now be a good time for that question on if you're giving an example on mixed methods first initiated by qual, then followed by quantitative data?
No, I think it would be better for me to return to that question later on. Is that
Absolutely.
okay?
Mutiara will
Okay.
revisit.
Yeah. Okay. So, for example, if we have a look here, yes. After the quantitative analysis of the test scores and the qualitative observations of the median child, the researchers, their conclusion is providing textbook raises average test scores elsewhere, but it does not do so in primary schools in rural Kenya because children could not read their textbooks. That would have been a meta-inference. Because we have these quantitative analysis of test scores, we have the qualitative observations of the median child, and here we have this meta-inference. But as we saw, no, the researchers did not stop there, but they went further and they did another quantitative subgroup analysis of test scores, and then they refined their meta-inference. But they could have stopped here, but they decided to continue.
Okay.
Okay, then I think another important implication is that I think it's not so much, often it's said, yes, the research question is leading in mixed method research. But I think that it's not so much the research question, but it's the aim to obtain a deep understanding of a phenomenon, which is leading in making decisions during the research process, such as choosing methods. And I will go to the next slide now to show that why I think that the research question is not leading. So in the textbook case, we started with the claim providing textbook raises average test scores in primary schools. Then there was a research question. Does providing textbooks raise average test scores in primary schools in rural Kenya? So there was an answer to that research question, namely providing textbook does not raise average test scores for children in primary schools in rural Kenya. But this research question, does providing textbooks raise average test scores in primary school in rural Kenya, was just the beginning. It was not leading the whole mixed method study, but it was the beginning, because the researchers then continued and asked, why did providing textbook not raise average test scores in primary schools in rural Kenya? And then they found an explanation. The median child could not read their textbook. After that, they continued and asked, for whom did providing textbook raise average test scores in primary schools in Kenya? The answer was it raised average test scores for children with high pretest scores. Then they asked, why did providing textbook raise the scores for children with high pretest scores but not for others? And then the answer was, unlike the other, students with high pretest scores were probably able to read their textbooks. Now, none of these questions, one could say, is really from the beginning leading the mixed method study. It's rather the case that they are formulated based on what the researchers found. So they found providing textbook did not raise average test scores, and they asked themselves why. And then they had an explanation, and then they asked themselves, yes, for whom did providing textbooks perhaps still raise average test scores? And after they found an answer to that, then they asked, why did providing textbooks raise average test scores for some but not for others? So the research question was really following what happened in the
study. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you, Judith.
Okay, then there is another point that claims that are relevant at the beginning of a study often lose their relevance by the end of the study. So contrary to, for example, Joe Maxwell, who always says, yes, a quantitative research method can show that something has an effect, and qualitative research explains why. But I think often claims lose their relevance. So, for example, here at the beginning, the claim providing textbook raises average test scores in primary schools is important, and it's also important it does not raise average test scores. So this contradiction is an important one. So at the beginning, it's important that researchers found that children in primary schools in rural Kenya, that their textbook did not raise average test scores. But after the study, when we have arrived at this moderated case, it has become irrelevant whether providing textbook did raise average test scores for all those children in the primary schools in Kenya, or whether it did not raise an average test scores there, because what is relevant is that providing textbooks can only raise test scores if children have the ability to read the textbook. And whether perhaps in Kenya there were more children who could not read their textbook or less, for this becomes then less relevant. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, then I will continue to the next slide. The same applies to the language problem case, because at the beginning it's important that there is this contradiction, and the question, do language problems affect GPA or do they not affect GPA? Lee and Green found that in their study, language problems did not affect GPA. But in the end, what's relevant is that language problems do affect GPA in a negative sense, unless students have compensating strategies. And again, whether the researchers for those students in their study found that overall language problems affected GPA or not is not relevant anymore. Okay.
Yes, now we've had some interesting back and forth in the chat window. One of our attendees asking, they are looking for examples on how one can develop research questions in mixed methods, starting from qualitative rather than quantitative. And we've got some folks that are weighing in. Do you have any examples you can list, Judith?
Yes, I can. Of course. So, for example, one thing that's always very important is in intervention studies, and to use to interview the members of the target group and to use their input in developing research, in developing interventions. So yes, so I think that's one example, and also more generally, if we, for example, would like to use interviews to find out, okay, what's going on, what's possible, what are relevant, say, problems for people, relevant themes, and then this could be followed up by quantitative research for the purpose of generalization.
Thank you, Judith. We have a couple of other questions that have come up. Are you comfortable taking a couple more at this point, or do you want to continue?
No, I think I want to continue for a moment, okay, but so they are still there, so I can answer them perhaps later on. So here's my point of I think that this case development process is basically independent from the classification of a study as concurrent or a sequential study. So, for example, the Glebes study in Kenya had a sequential design, so quantitative analysis of test scores was followed by qualitative data collection and analysis. Only after they discovered, oh, it doesn't have an effect, how can we explain that? And then they started the qualitative data collection. Whereas the Lee and Green study had a concurrent design because the interviews and quantitative analysis were performed more or less the same time, and also the quantitative interviews were not based. The qualitative interviews were not based on what they found in the quantitative data, or vice versa. So that, I think, is interesting. So we have a pattern that can be seen in much of mixed method research, namely this order of controversial case, subcases, and a moderated case.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, I will continue. So I think it also affects quality criteria for mixed method research. I think quality, that's always my first thing, is related to the extent to which different perspectives stakeholder theories, disciplines, methods, etc., have been included. I will go to the next slide because I haven't said much about this, but I wanted to mention it because I think it's so very, very important. What I had shown, hopefully, is that quality, for me, mixed method research quality, also the extent to which claims have been further developed and also data have been exhausted. And I can show you again this example. Because as I said, the researchers might have decided to stop here after they only had done their quantitative analysis and said, oh well, this textbook do not have an effect in primary schools in rural Kenya. But they did not. They went further, and then they found an explanation through mixed method research, namely children could not read their textbook. They could have stopped there, but again they went further and then concluded that there were two subgroups, and one of the groups of children who were able to read their textbook and one of them who were not able to read their textbook. And I think, so one could say that these researchers really went very far in further developing their meta-inference. And so in that sense, I think this is a mixed method study of high quality, because they did not stop here, but they went further to further develop not only further develop their claim, but also to develop this moderated claim.
And Judith, at this point, I think we have enough questions that we may need to address these in a PDF afterwards. Would you like to continue with the rest of your slides? And in the time remaining, we'll take what questions we can.
Okay, that's a good idea. Thank you. Yes. Okay. So quality is the extent to which claims have been further developed, and sound decisions about further development have been made during the research process. And here I can refer to this slide again, because these claims on the right side also show a lot of claim development. So these were not, it's not the developing meta-inference, but it is the several claims that have been developed. And here one could say are subsequent research questions, yes, but they're also decisions. So this was the main research questions at the beginning, but here a decision was made to try to find an explanation and ask a research question, why did providing textbook? Here a decision was made to look at subgroups, and again here a decision was made to look for an explanation. And I think also the quality of a mixed method research study is very much related to that these questions are made during the study and how they are made. Okay, and finally, but I think by now this is not really a surprise, that also one quality criterion is the extent to which a moderated claim has been developed, which we saw in both cases. And I also think that for me, the moderated claim plays a very important role, because it not only indicates a further development of the meta-inference, but also it's also a focus. So if you as a researcher find that language problems do not affect GPA, I think it's not your task to explain for every individual why this individual differs from why for this individual the effect does not occur, but your task is to look for those things like compensating strategies. So it's not your task to explain why a student without language problems, for example, has a low GPA, because that can have many causes, and the interesting thing is to find groups like these students with language problems and still a high GPA, and then who also had these compensating strategies. Okay, finally, I think this case development process is not unique to mixed method research, but it can be applied to all research or to much of it. It can be applied to multi-method and mono method research. And also, as I've shown, it can be applied, say, between two studies. So, for example, in the Glevis study, there is also a controversial case with previous research. So previous research is also very important in developing your claims. And in the Lee and Green example, it was basically a reanalysis of their published data through which I developed this idea of the compensating strategies, which also then involved two different studies. Well, if you want to read about this, you can find my article there. And there is the literature that I mentioned, and I would like to thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith. We've had a lot of questions come in these final minutes. So I'm going to go back to Lori Foote and see if we can answer at least her question. And then for the rest of you, anyone else who has questions, we'll be taking those questions. I'll be sending them to Judith, and she'll prepare a PDF with some answers for you that will get posted along with the video and the slide deck of this presentation. Okay?
So, yeah, this will be a very large PDF.
Well, hopefully not. Hopefully not too. However, from Lori Foote, we have, it seems that the explanations you've discussed have come out of surprising study results. Can you envision a study that begins with a theory about subgroup differences and therefore uses the study to confirm or disconfirm the theory behind group differences?
Yes, and well, perhaps it's not so much, I think, confirming or disconfirming, but perhaps my example of the procrastination study is an interesting example, because the qualitative interviews were not so much about confirming that we know that students have different degrees of procrastination, but rather to find out about the worlds that are behind these, say, quantitative differences in procrastination. So I think that's one answer. Another answer is yes, indeed, you can start with say expected group differences. So, for example, for me also this case comparison table is very useful, because if you have existing group differences, so you have say interviews with people, and then they are you can also in a quantitative column indicate some characteristics, and you expect differences between groups, and then you might discover that actually you do not find these differences, and that can also be a reason for you to look very carefully, because most likely you will be able to find some groups, but then perhaps other groups than the groups that you started with. Yes.
Thank you so much, Judith. Another question from Chris. Are you familiar with a published article that describes the approach you have used in your presentation?
The approach in my presentation, well, my article about develop your case.
I was hoping that would be the correlative. Yeah, this is good. Yeah. One more question, and then I'll go to our final slide and do a little bit of plugging for IIQM before we wrap up for today. From Mutiera again, I've heard a term called multiple methods coined to studies with less balance of qualitative and quantitative in the methodology. Can you provide more explanation on this in comparison to mixed methods, like how balanced should we go to be able to claim our study as mixed methods?
Okay, well, That's also a very interesting question, because as I also said in my one of my last slides, I think this case development process can also be applied to multi-method or mono-method research. So I think basically, although I think that in much of say research in which you're trying to obtain a deep understanding of a phenomenon, you will use mixed qualitative and quantitative method. I think in itself, looking for a balance between qualitative and quantitative, I I doubt whether that's very useful. I think it makes sense at every step that you take, that you look very carefully at, okay, what do I have and what would be my next step and my next question, and perhaps the idea of head controversial case, finding subgroups, and finding a moderated case could be something that might be helpful, rather than trying to balance qualitative and quantitative research. That said, I think that in general, yeah, for a deep understanding, I think we need qualitative research, especially interviews are very useful, but other data. And I want to emphasize that I think that this subgroup analysis is a really interesting method, which is not used that often, but I think it's very relevant. And it had been developed not as the case comparison table, but the idea of looking for groups, so to speak, without exceptions, was already there in the 30s with this concept of analytic induction.
Wonderful. Judith, thank you so much. I'm going to put us to our last slide for today. I'd like to invite everyone to join us on our next webinar as well. And before I get too much into this, Judith, thank you so much for a very informative presentation. We've had a lot of thank yous coming in on the chat window. It's been a real pleasure. So on behalf of IIQM, of course, thank you so much for today. So again, our next Mixed Methods webinar is coming up on February 18th. That's Dr. Leah Kane, Ethical Considerations in Mixed Methods Research. Registration can be found on our IIQM site on the University of Alberta website, www.ualberta.ca. If you search IIQM, it will come up. We also have archives of this and other video webinar series, and you can find those under our webinar tab, archives under our various streams. And last but not least, registration and abstract submission is now open for our Thinking Qualitatively conference, which is coming up June 15th through 19th this year here in Edmonton at the Edmonton Clinic Health Academy. We have a special focus this year, focused on intersectionality. That's in partnership with the University of Alberta's research at the intersections of gender. And again, registration is open, and you can find the registration link on our IIQM website on the University of Alberta page. Thank you again, Judith. Any last words before we sign off?
Well, I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity, and also all those attending for asking the questions, and I will really try to answer them as best I can.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Judith, and thank you everyone for attending today.